Well, hello and welcome to this new video in the series in which I am reviewing Todd May's book, Death. Last time we've seen some of the ways human beings are dealing with death, and we've also seen that none of those ways are unfortunately satisfying. That's because death has the ability to take away the meaning out of our lives and the meaning out of whatever it is that we do to cope with death. And so the way we ended with was religion. People would go to religion because it allows one to survive their own death, like it offers an afterlife where we get to continue existing as ourselves. So in here we are talking about something that is akin to immortality. We also mentioned that given the problems that death brings to us, we can either consider two cures. We can either become unaware of death or cure death altogether. Like, we can get rid of the anxiety that we experience when facing death by becoming immortals. Now, whether we have the technology or the means to cure death in that way, that's not the issue. The issue is more like, let's imagine what life would be like if we didn't die and see if that is a desirable life. If we want to continue our lives safe from death, the thing that runs the risk of taking away the meaning of our lives, well, the natural thing to do is to get rid of that thing. But then May asks, he asks us to consider if a life without death would be meaningful at all. And so this is the question he answers in the second chapter of his book, Death and Immortality. Now, to conceive of a human life without death is quite a challenge because, as Todd May says, if, as I have argued, death is a central fact of human life, then it becomes difficult to imagine human life without it. In some sense, an immortal life is no longer a human life. So if we want immortality, well, we cannot be human beings anymore, and that's what the book is going to be arguing for. So let's try to imagine what life would be like for us without death. And May says that when we are immortal, we can think of only two ways to be immortal. We are either immortals who know that we are immortal, or immortals who don't know that they are immortals. So let's start with immortals that don't think that they are immortals. Now, there is a version of this that we can easily wipe out, which is not knowing that we are immortal as believing we are mortal. Like, we are immortals who think that they are mortal. Now, this scenario would be very absurd because thinking that we are mortal, well, it simply puts us back to square one and we just run again the same argument, and it would lead us back here. So it would lead us into asking if whether or not a life without death is worth it or not, if it's meaningful or not. So it's just a circular reasoning that leads us back to posit that, well, let's see what life would look like if we were immortal. So we can just drop that version. Instead, we can say that we are not aware of our immortality, but without knowing of death either. And so this means that questions about death or living forever simply don't come to our minds. So here we're imagining that we are living like we would if we were mortal, but as immortals who don't even know that they are immortals, and they are not at all haunted by the thought of death. So this, however, would be impossible for May because, as he argues, to be able to live our immortal lives exactly like we live our mortal lives requires that we keep projecting ourselves in the future, which means that we can imagine what the future would look like. He draws from the 18th century philosopher David Hume, who says that the human beings assume the future will resemble the past in the sense that what seem to be causal relations will continue to hold. So if we can keep that continuity in mind without ever the thought of that continuity, the thought that continuity can end, that the unfolding of the world can suddenly stop, that the claim of causality can suddenly break. If if we do not have that conception that, you know, at one point the chain of causality can break, then we are aware of our immortality. As May says, we would form our plans, commitments and relationships in light of the fact that the future will just keep going. And what is that but the awareness of immortality? So to put it simply, let's say the faculty of being capable of projecting ourselves in the future in the way that we do cannot be compatible with being unaware of our state. If we are mortal and we are capable of projecting ourselves in the future, then that also means that we know that we are mortal. And if we are immortal and have the capacity of projecting ourselves in the future, well, that means that we know that we are immortal. So if we project ourselves in the future, we can either do it with the knowledge that the chain of causality that links the past to the future is going to break, which means that we know that we are mortal, or with the knowledge that the chain of causality will not break, which means that we know that we are immortal. So in the end, there cannot be a mortal human being who doesn't know that he is mortal, unless we're talking about someone whose cognitive abilities are very limited, like a child or someone with a severe handicap, and there cannot also be an immortal human being who is unaware of their immortality. To quote May, we are either aware of our mortality or aware of our immortality. We find ourselves then with only one real imaginative option to consider human beings who are both immortal and aware of their immortality. So now that we know that we can only be immortals that are aware of their immortality, well, let's say what immortality would do to us, like what are its effects. So one question to ask is about aging. So being immortal doesn't necessarily mean that we do not age. And if you keep aging forever, well, that can be quite unbearable, right? Like, unless we have means to delay or stop the aging process, being immortal would resemble the life of a Struldbergs. Now, Struldbergs are fictional immortal characters from Jonathan Swift's famous satire Gulliver's Travels. These are creatures that live their life like they live their immortality as a continuous health and physical decline, which isn't very appealing. Many would prefer a mortal life than that kind of immortality. What we want instead is, as May writes, an immortality that allows us to remain vibrant, one that at least keeps us physically vigorous and leaves room for emotional and intellectual development. It cannot be either an eternal childhood, in which we do not understand the full possibilities a human life can offer, nor a decrepitude in which we cannot carry out the involvements in which a vital human life consists. So, we are looking for an immortality that allows us to do the things we want to keep as mortals, but somehow that immortality won't make those things lose their meaning. Like, this is what we want. As May says, immortality yields that death deprives us of the ability to cultivate our plans, commitments, and relationships. So what we want is to keep those things. And so the question is such immortality possible and worth having? So what this kind of immortality can offer to us, according to May, is it allows us to think about continuing the threads of our lives without their being cut off. Like, think of a relationship, for example. You can be devoted to a partner without the fear of losing each other or your kids to death. And even more so, being immortal, you can also spend time away from each other without the fear that that time would have a negative effect on your relationship. Don't forget that, after all, we have the time for everything, including finding each other again. So what is gained with an immortal life when it comes to relationships is that we always have the possibility of working on our relationship, of starting anew, of taking breaks, trying new things, etc. I can tell you that I had one or two relationships in which being immortal would have spared us a lot of emotional abuse. It is also the same thing with friendships. Knowing that we are immortal, you know that you will eventually see your friends again. If your best friend goes to live abroad, and whatever commitment they get into, you know that sooner or later you still have the possibility of meeting them again. And so May illustrates this with an ancient Chinese tradition in which those who are to become the kingdom's bureaucrats were raised together. So they form deep friendships, and after they finish their education, they're sent to the different corners of the kingdom to hold their offices. And what they do is that they keep writing to each other about a rock garden in which they all continue. They all contribute to its design and to its construction, so that when they retire, they can all build that garden and come to live together in it. Quote, "This was a way of keeping them involved in a common project and of promising them a future together during the often lonely years of service in the far corners of the Chinese empire." And so we too had experiences like these, when we, like for example, when you are with your friends and you're all getting drunk, we always come up with ideas of having our own bar and live forever with each other. So making projects like these is a way of maintaining those relationships as having always a project to attend to. Like sometimes, like something is always tying us to the future, to the engagement, and I can tell you that when you are in a relationship, like I always try to keep things undone for the future, so that way we can still imagine that we still have things to do together, and so that would nurture the relationship. Like one of my ex-girlfriends, when we were together, told me that she'll get me, for example, some books that I really wanted, and having made that, we can have some sort of reassurance that the relationship is still going because there are still things to be made, to be experienced. Or like when we were talking of going abroad to live in some place like Malaysia or Switzerland, stuff like that. These are projects that gives us some hope that the relationship is still going, that the engagements aren't going to be severed until breakups happen, and now you're left with the thought of those projects that never came to fruition. They're just threads hanging in the void now. Now, yeah, you can still do those things with somebody else, and doing them with someone can be as good, perhaps better than with the person you planned that with in the first place. But there's always a melancholy attached to it, and also the point isn't to actually do them. Like if we stayed together with my ex-girlfriend and we never went to Malaysia, it's fine, because the point of making that plan isn't much about going to Malaysia, but to have a sense that the relationship is still going. So that's the same thing with the Chinese garden. Like the bureaucrats can die before, living there. Some of them can just peace out of the friendship. But as long as the communication about the future garden is going, well, the relationship is going too. Quote, "The communal designing of the rock garden was a way to maintain the relationships in a common endeavor, and at the same time to give them hope for an eventual return to something like the time in which those relationships were born." But sure, knowing that those projects can be severed by a breakup, for example, doesn't make it easier to make those plans. You know when some people are afraid of commitment, for example. You know people who are afraid of engagements because they're afraid that their efforts, their projects within the relationship wouldn't lead to anything. Like if you're putting 100% in the relationship and the relationship ends, it kind of feel like you wasted so much time and energy for nothing. So being immortal would solve that, because you know that whatever effort was made, there's always time for your efforts to bear their fruits. So like your partner isn't going anywhere, you know, if you are immortal. Sometimes people don't get into commitments because the commitment would mean that they have to break some threads with other commitments in their lives that they don't want to break. I know a person who refuses to be in a relationship because of that. It's someone who loves to travel, who loves to meet new people, and that's where she finds enjoyment and meaning. And she feels that being in a relationship would break those engagements. But May talks about this. Another advantage of immortality is that we no longer have to make choices like those. Like this friend, knowing that she is immortal, won't have to choose between either her travels or a relationship. Maybe for her it's not really a choice because a relationship isn't something that she wants. She never feels lonely, never feels the want to go on dates, never feels the desire to form a relationship. But others certainly have that problem, where they have to choose between two things that they want, and they know, being mortal, they don't have enough time for both. And so with immortality, the problem of having to make choices between things is solved. Like classic cases is when you have to choose between your career or your family, or when you have a passion but you also need to put food on the table. That kind of stuff that we all know so well. And May says we learn as we grow older that one cannot be everything one wants to be. One must make choices. All of us at some point or another let go of futures we have envisioned for ourselves. And so with immortality, it will always, I will always have the time to do all choices. Not necessarily simultaneously, but eventually I will have my passion, I will leave my career, I will have time for a family, for my family, etc. Quote, if we were immortal, we would not face those choices. Our lives would not be constrained by the choices we do make, because we would be able to make others. In this sense, it would eliminate one of the greatest sadness of life, regret. And so this is the type of regret that people would say they feel on their deathbed, like they never allow themselves to do the things they wanted to do. It's the kind of regret that makes you feel that your life is meaningless, that you didn't get what you deserved from it, and now it's about to be swept under the rug of the rug of nothingness. Quote, to fail to become something one works or trains or educates oneself for is a disappointment, but it pales in comparison to the regret of wondering whether one could have been that if one had only taken one's chances. So if we are immortal, we won't have those fears anymore. It would be okay to maintain that garden, because you know that even though some of your friends can leave the project, they can always come back to it. There's always time for them to come back. When you have the ideas of a project, for example, and let's say you started working on, you start to work on it for a moment, and then it went on standby because I don't know, some of you got involved with some other stuff and all of that. You can afford to take the break from the project, because you know that sooner or later the project will be eventually done. So being immortal means that you can be sure that the project will be picked up at one point, and you don't have to feel like time is running out and you didn't do much with your life, and so you are pressed to finish this project because you don't want to kick up the bucket feeling like a failure. You don't have to live with those regrets. And so, as May writes, with immortality, we would have access to what the ancient Chinese functionaries sought, with the addition that we could do it anywhere or at any time, circumstances permitting. Moreover, on the assumption we're working with, that immortality does not age us physically, we would have the energy to cultivate those relationships once we resume them. It would allow for every project to be accomplished, circumstances permitting. At least it would not undercut those projects for lack of time. So here, the immortality that doesn't include aging would be perfect to solve the first two themes of death. We wouldn't have to be worrying about disappearing, and we wouldn't have to worry about threads that get cut off. And of course, the third theme is also involved, that death is inevitable and uncertain. We won't have to worry about that either. So as May puts it, it seems like immortality can be the cure we are looking for. Quote, immortality then would at the very least allow us to continue the threads of our lives, the engagements that characterize human being, and would blunt the force of a certain kind of regret. It would appear then that immortality would enhance our lives in crucial ways. An immortal life, by overcoming the difficulties associated with death, would make our lives more meaningful. Or so it seems. Now that's a weird twist there, isn't it? Or so it seems. Isn't immortality as great as we thought? Well, it seems weird for May to argue that immortality would allow us to have meaningful lives without regret, when in the previous chapter he said that as he was about to die, he didn't have any regrets. Like May is mortal, right? And so him being able not to regret his life would be impossible if, the account of immortality is true. So what are we looking for here? Is it possible that these advantages of immortality aren't that advantageous in the end? Like, is there a dark side to immortality? And the answer is yes. There is a problem with immortality, and that is within the reason it is reassuring. The problem with immortality is time. Immortality is reassuring because it gives you all the time that you need, but at the same time, that's also the problem with immortality. There is always time for everything. So although that can help us avoid having to feel any regrets, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have its problems. And it doesn't also mean that its problems aren't worse than regret. So May gives an example from his life. When he was young, he used to play the saxophone. And he was in a band and all of that, but then the band split, and May didn't play the saxophone ever since. So being immortal, he would eventually pick up the saxophone again, and his band will eventually come back to their rock garden, and they would jam together forever. However, as May says, when you have an infinite amount of time for playing the piano, at one point you're going to get bored. Quote, at some point it begins to strain credulity to believe that one could stay immersed in a practice for an infinite amount of time. And so sure, musicians always seem like they never get bored of playing music. Even when they're old, they still continue to make concerts. But as May point, that's because they are mortal. They want to experience the most out of their passion as long as they are alive, which they know won't be for long. Quote, they throw themselves into what they are doing because they want to be as accomplished as possible in the limited amount of time they have to play. And that time is very limited, 70 or 80 years at the outside. But if you multiply that number by, infinity, it becomes not so soothing anymore. And that is for two reasons. First, you know that you're either going to be done with novelty because there's always time for for everything. When you know that there is always time, you lose the sense of, you have to get it done now, otherwise you'll miss out on it. As May says, the events of lives, both good and bad, have an urgency that they do not have for the immortals. An immortal does not worry about missing anything. There is time for it to be experienced. In fact, there is time for it to be repeatedly, infinitely experienced. For those of us who die, there is a singularity to the moments of our existence. For the immortals, by contrast, there is only repetition. So, if you want to put it differently, in the good place, the main characters, they meet Hypatia, who is a Neoplatonist philosopher of the 4th and 5th century AD, and it is played by Lisa Kudrow. And she says this:
on paper, this is paradise. All your desires and needs are met, but it's infinite. And when perfection goes on forever, you become this glassy-eyed mush person.
But no, because Patty, no!
Yes, I'm telling you, I used to be cool, man. I studied so much things, art and music and the one with the number piles, where I'd be like 2 and you'd be like 6.
Math?
Yes, and then I came here, where time stretched out forever, and every second of my existence was amazing, but my brain became this big, dumb blob.
Yeah, so at some point, everything you'll do with the saxophone is just repetition, and you'll feel stuck in a loop. When people feel like they're just repeating things without any room for novelty, that can sap away the meaning of the activity. And that's the first reason. And the second reason is not much of a loop, but a never-ending straight line. So if you feel like there is never a point in which you be like, well, I have nothing to learn anymore now, well, that too can sap away the meaning. At a certain point, it's going to be like, when am I going to hit the final note? This is unbearable, right? So meaning can also be derived from knowing that at one point you are going to hit the final note, like you play the final chord. But if there is no end to it, this too is a recipe for boredom. In short, even the deepest of passions is likely to fade with the passage of enough time. So sure, once you're bored, you can put it down and go do something else, but since we have time for absolutely everything, then at one point you'll do everything repeatedly, again and again and again. And so there is going to be a moment where you're going to get bored with everything. And so to say that there will always be something else to do means that we have to be living in a world with infinite resources. Quote, there aren't always other things, places, or people. There are many of them, to be sure, but the planet is a limited place with limited number of practices. Sooner or later, one sees what there is to see, does what there is to do, and meets whomever is around. And even if there are infinite resources, there is still a problem, which is our individual tastes and our individual choices. When we practice something, we often get satisfaction and meaning from it because we want to do that practice, not because we are avoiding boredom, right? So there are, as May says, activities that I am passionate about and others that I am not. Some activities will bore me just by practicing them for a few days. What I need to engage, I mean, if there is a meaningful activity, what is needed for me to engage in that activity is motivation, and doing something that doing something just so that I don't get bored, well, that's not very motivating. So that's a big problem. There's also another problem with infinite resources, and that is, when I finish something, I know that I'll always be able to move to another. It also means that the something that I'm doing right now is also infinite. So you'll never feel like you finished something, because there's still many things that you don't know. There's still a note that you didn't play yet. And so you either get an infinite line or an infinite loop, and neither are appealing. What they are is more like they take away the meaning of those activities. So even your relationships, when you are immortal, lose what made them meaningful in the first place. When there's always time to fix a broken relationship, fixing it won't matter, because precisely there is an infinite amount of time. So why would you rush? Why even fix the relationship when you know that there is an infinite time for you to do that? As a result, relationships would become less serious, because the stakes would dramatically decrease. So if my partner is hurt or feels lonely or whatever she can be going through, I wouldn't take that as seriously as I would knowing that neither of us will live forever. And so being immortal, I can just walk away from the relationship if I don't want to deal with my partner's struggles, and be confident that I'll just have another relationship with someone else. There's always time for that. And so friendship's significance would also be diminished. Our activities, our vulnerabilities, everything that we share, everything that we do to challenge each other, to help each other in face of adversity, all of them would lose their significance, since our immortality would make our sacrifices for each other contingent and insignificant. My devotions to my friends or my partner won't have that much of an effect on their lives if we were all immortal. And so this is also true for relationships between parents and children. Knowing that my kid is immortal would make me care less about them. Our bonds would certainly slacken if my child were never going to be reliant on me for their survival. Even if we say that they still need affection and nurturing or education, since there is an infinite amount of time, they're certainly managed to get get those things from somewhere else. I mean, it doesn't even have to be from me, And so when we talked about the rock garden, when we have always time to design it, chances are no one is going to design it. To quote May, immortality would render such arrangements superfluous, because it would keep the door always open to picking up the relationships. There would be no need to plan for old age, because there would be no old age. There would be no need even to fix a time in which to meet again, because there would always be a time. So from our perspective, that can have disastrous consequences from an ethical standpoint. If there is always time to act, then nothing, absolutely nothing presses us to act. And so whether we see someone in pain, knowing that they are immortal and that there is always time to help them, may end up being a reason not to help them. Here May turns to another philosopher, Martha Nussbaum, who argues that in the case of immortality, we would lose many of our virtues precisely because they are predicated on our mortality. Our virtues have their meaning from the fact that we are finite creatures, and that our life is limited, and so are our opportunities to engage in meaningful projects. She writes, "The intensity and dedication with which very many human activities are pursued cannot be explained without reference to the awareness that our opportunities are finite, that we cannot choose these activities indefinitely many times. In raising a child, in cherishing a lover, in performing a demanding task of work or thought or artistic creation, we are aware at some level of the thought that each of these efforts is structured and constrained by finite time." And so in one of her reflections, she gives the example of the Greek gods. The Greek gods are an example of what would happen to us if we were immortal. And so indeed the Greek gods are always engaged in some debauchery. They're acting like scums towards each other. And so like the immortal the immoral attitude of the Greek gods is interpreted by Nosbon as stemming from their knowledge that they are immortal and that they always have the time for everything. Quote, courage, for instance, would be absent since it would be impossible to risk one's life for anything. Moderation would be less pressing since our bodies would not be threatened by our activity. Even justice would be imperiled. The needs for others would not urge themselves on us in the same way, since their existence would not be threatened by our neglect. So in other words, when you are immortal, there is no imperative to help others. There is no urgency whatsoever. And if that is the case, we can confidently conclude that immortality is as much a threat to our meaning than death will ever be. Not only it renders all of our ethical engagements like relationships, whether romantic relationships, friendships, parent and kids, co-workers, comrades, whatever, it makes them obsolete. But it also threatens to turn the thing we're passionate about into dull, long process of either never finishing anything or repeating everything all the time. Quote, immortality then threatens our engagement both externally and internally. Externally, it threatens them by dragging them on forever beyond the human capacity to remain involved. Internally, it threatens them through a sort of psychological debilitation. The urgency we associate with our engagement, an urgency that stems from the fact that sooner or later we will have lost the time to complete or at least to participate in them, goes missing in immortality. So we can here turn to a story that May mentions in the beginning of this chapter about the consequences of immortality. And so the chapter, the second chapter started with May mentioning this the short story. It's a short story written by the Argentinian writer, not sure of the pronunciation, George Louis Borges, but not sure, sorry. The story is called The Immortal, in which a guy named Joseph Cartaphilus tells his own story as he becomes immortal. And so the conclusion of the story is that immortality is just as bad as death. Like, it confers no meaning, it makes everything seem as vain and pointless as death. But we have to explain why immortality would lead to such conclusion. As May asks, why, for the immortals, are all undertakings in vain? So to answer this, let's look at the plot. So Cartaphilus learned about some mystic river in Egypt that cures death. If you bathe in it, death will be cleansed of you, right? So near the river, there is a city, the city of the Immortals, where, you know, the people who bathed in the river and gained immortality are now living like they live in that city, and that city they build it themselves. So he goes looking for the river, but things don't go as planned, and he ends up in the desert, tired, thirsty, and hungry. And he also has his at one point he gets his hands tied, but those are details. But lucky for him, he soon finds a body of water and throws himself into it. And so he's no longer thirsty, but he is so tired and hungry that he cannot move. He cannot get himself out of the water. But also lucky for him, that water is from the river that he is looking for. So he became immortal. And also looking for him, he's not alone. There are people in that area whom he later calls the troglodytes. These are wizened, stooped men without speech who, he describes them, they devour serpents. So you can think that he's going to be okay, like he's immortal now and he is well surrounded. Well, surely those people will help him get his strength back. Maybe they will nurture him, but that's not at all what happens. The troglodytes, they just stare at him struggling. They offer no help, And so eventually Cartaphilus frees himself, gets back on his feet, and slowly walks away. And so he keeps looking for the city of the Immortals. And now, as he leaves, one of the troglodytes decides to follow him, and Cartaphilus named him Argos, after the Greek hero Odysseus' dog, Argos from the Odyssey. And we later learn that this troglodyte was in fact Homer, the poet who wrote the Odyssey. And so as they wander, they arrive at some sort of labyrinth that is in ruins. And May tells us that the reason why none of the troglodyte helped him is because there was no need to help him, since his life wasn't in danger. Homer even tells a similar story to Cartaphilus about a man who fell into a quarry and was left there for 70 years before anyone threw him a rope. His life was not in danger, but he spent those years burning with thirst. So this, according to May, does make sense from the point of view of the troglodytes. When you are immortal, you have time for everything, and therefore everything will be done at one point or another. Quote, there is nothing an immortal being cannot eventually do, and in fact, nothing he or she will not eventually do. If one is going to live forever, there is, in the literal sense, time for everything. And so in this sense, each immortal knows that they will do everything. Like Homer being an immortal, he was bound to produce the Odyssey at some point in his immortal existence. The only impossibility for him would be not to make the Odyssey. And so what this leads to is a situation of pure inaction. Knowing that eventually you will write the Iliad and you will write the Odyssey implies that there is no rush to it. There are no stakes involved, no pressure or reason to write them. Writing the poems will eventually will happen on its own accord, eventually in due time. And so you just sit back and watch the word unfold until you suddenly watch your body pick up a piece of paper and a pen and start writing. And so this is very different for us. For mortals, things their lives are contingent. They may or may not happen. This is what makes our lives fragile and pushes us to be active in our lives. We don't have the time for everything, so we must choose what is more important for us, what matters more for us. So there is a sense of urgency that we have to act. By contrast, what we are looking at in the immortal story is a world in which the immortals live in speculation, in which immortals have completely retreated from any distinction between good and bad, between moral and immoral. Like all axiological differences and categories don't seem to exist in their world. Quote, seen from the longest point of view, there is little to distinguish good from bad. So instead of striving to accomplish something in this world, the immortals withdrew into a world of pure speculation. And so May explains what is meant by speculation. The troglodytes seem to be a bunch of dudes spending all of their immortal existence meditating. Okay, and so this can be seen as something that is positive if you are a philosopher, like philosophical or abstract topics can be an activity that has no end and in which you can spend all of your time dwelling in. This can be certainly a cure for the boredom we mentioned earlier. Topics like mathematics can be something like that, or spending your days imagining or daydreaming. These are activities that can sound like a good alternative to boredom, but we have to understand that speculation isn't really meditation. And even if it was meditation, this won't mean anything actually, because the point of meditation is destroyed by immortality. Like meditation itself is an activity by mortals for mortals. When it's immortals who do that, it loses all of its significance. So first, Immortality will make meditation just another activity to do, just to avoid boredom. And we can link this as May does with Nigel's argument that life itself is positive. I remember Thomas Nagel from the first video. We can just spend our immortality just enjoying that small feeling of simply being alive, like an immortality of simplicity. But to this, May responds with, meditation aids us in our lives. It is not a substitute for life. Bare experience, life without the emotional and intellectual involvement of our ongoing engagements, cannot be endured for very long. The mind, the body have to move on. This positivity does not extend to immortality. Like our project, pure experience cannot keep life worth living over an infinite period of time. So indeed, even I cannot be a philosopher forever. Even I would get bored of thinking about concepts or reading philosophical books. So speculation here have another meaning than meditating or thinking. It is a withdrawal from activity. When you speculate, you are looking at the world like a spectacle. Okay, so the speculator is a spectator. And here, May highlights a difference between speculating and thinking. Thinking is an activity, that's an action. We also need to be able to distinguish which thought is good and which one is bad, which thought is worthy to be entertained, and which one is to be discarded. And in speculation, however, our own thoughts become a spectacle as well. So in a spectacle, you no longer distinguish which one is good, which one is bad. As May says, one speculates not as a thinker but as a spectator. One watches the spectacle take place before one, not entirely interested in the proceeding. So because even our thoughts, when we are immortal, are subject to the same process as the physical world, there is time to think about everything. So the immortals are even further removed, not just from the physical, which doesn't interest them, but even from their own thoughts as well. So they get into a stage of pure thought, a stage so pure that nothing troubles the process of thought unfolding. They, as May put it, this tells us why the immortals choose to live in pure thought rather than in the physical world. So the immortals, they become completely idealists who have no reason to be involved with the physical world. Whatever happens in the physical world, whatever happens in the physical happens. So I don't have to be involved in it or even to care about it. If I have to care, then I'll do it. I'll do it when I will do it in due time. So, quote, this is why the physical world doesn't interest them. If they have not seen it all, they eventually will. And so this disenchantment from the real physical world proves that whatever it is that they are speculating, that isn't thinking. For thought is not divorced from the physical world, right? So the second reason the troglodytes won't satisfy philosophers as thinkers, beside that we will get bored with philosophy when we are immortals, is that philosophers insist that thought must be engaged in the physical world, as it is always the result of the physical world moving us. So, to quote May, we can see now why the immortals in Borges is sure. I really should check how to pronounce names before I start shooting videos. So we can see now why the immortals in Borges' story retreated into pure thought. Nothing in the world could move them, so they lived in caves and engaged in pure speculation. And so, contrary to the troglodyte speculation, philosophy and thinking are active. It is not like most people think of philosophy as people who are who have their heads in the clouds, like they are divorced from this world and nourished only on idea. It is, philosophy is about being engaged with the world. Here May evokes a British philosopher, Bernard Williams, who took this issue very seriously. As May says about Williams, he disabuses us of such a view of philosophy and of the role of thought in sustaining an immortal life. William argues that for philosophers, as for other people, thought is not disengaged from the world, it is about the world. So indeed, the kind of question we ask in philosophy aren't like, the scholastic parody depicts. We're not, asking things like how many angels are dancing on a pinhead, for example. We're asking about actual lives, about actual things, how to live a good life, what is justice, what are the limits of my knowledge, am I free or determined? These are practical questions about practical aspects of our lives, and they aim at having an effect on the world, to change it and not just to interpret it like, Karl Marx always says. And so May gives the analogy with scientists who look at the world and try to understand its properties. What physicists or chemists and even mathematicians do isn't just some fun intellectual games, but they are engaged with the world so that they can adopt some kind of living and coexistence with that world that they are studying. So knowing about the climate entails some kind of attitude to have, some ethical posture, some actions we need to have in relation with the climate. And so same thing about diseases. Knowing about diseases entail that we cure them. Knowing about physics entails that we can shape our environment to make our lives easier and meaningful. And philosophy is like that too. It has this curiosity about the world as well, about one's own existence, its own meaning. So to quote May again, thought is in interaction with the other aspects of a person's life. In order for thought to be satisfying, it must intersect with those aspects in some way or another. This does not mean, for instance, that all philosophy must be applied philosophy. Rather, what it means is that my life and my thought cannot be entirely disengaged from one another. So thinking in a philosophical manner can only be fulfilling if it is related to the physical world that moves us. So the model of the troglodytes that require that one cuts themselves off from the world won't give us a meaningful use of thought as well. Here William writes specifically about this issue in an essay about immortality, which is mentioned in May's book. The essay is called The Macropoulos Case, Reflections on the Tedium of Immortality. And Macropoulos is the name of a fictional character from a play by a Czech writer, Karel Čapek. Not sure of the pronunciation, as always. And the play is called The Macropoulos Case or The Macropoulos Affair. And so it tells the story of a 16-year-old woman named Elena Macropoulos, who drank she drank an immortality potion made by her father, who was a court physician of a 16th century emperor. And so when the play starts, she is about 342 years old. And so she complains that her life is just miserable. And as Williams is analyzing the play, he writes about immortality that it leads to pure speculation, just like in the case of troglodytes. Quote, "It seems quite unreasonable to suppose that those activities, what William calls intense intellectual inquiry, would have the fulfilling or liberating character that they do have for him, if they were in fact all he could do or conceive of doing. If they are genuinely fulfilling, then the ground and shape of the satisfactions that the intellectual inquiry offers him will relate to him and not just to the inquiry." So in short, if speculating is the only thing we can do, then intellectual inquiry would be meaningless. It would turn into speculation, and we don't want that. We want our thoughts to be about us, about ourselves, about our lives, and so we don't want to be, spectators, especially with our thoughts. Okay, we don't want to be just watching our thoughts unfold like a spectator. We want to be active in them. And so in the case of immortality, there is such a gap that forms between our lives and our thoughts that we lose all taste in them. My thoughts would be meaningful if they arise and if they are related to my own personal experience. That's why May insisted, as we said, that his insight about death finds its origin in his near-death experience, and we mentioned that in the first video. So if my thoughts are not related to my experience, then they're not my thoughts. They're not mine. They're not even about myself. And so I have no reason to be the one leading those thoughts. So myself is removed from those thoughts like I don't exist. I am simply a spectator to thoughts that cannot even be my own. As May writes, intellectual inquiry emerges from a personal life and cannot be divorced from it. Therefore, to engage in intellectual inquiry solely for its own sake and apart from any interests one might have is not a life I could lead, because there would be no I there to lead it. Or, looked at from the perspective of an I, the pure speculation of the immortals would not offer the ground of a satisfying life. And so indeed, a life in which all my activities aren't about me or related to my own experience would be pretty, shapeless and pointless, because as May says, it would drag on endlessly. It would sooner or later just be a string of events lacking all form. And so here we can find this, the meaning of the architecture of the city. The city was actually a labyrinth. It is a labyrinth in the troglodytes' world, and Catharphilus understands that this labyrinth in ruins is, of course, the city of the immortals, or at least the labyrinth replaced the city. And the troglodytes were the immortals, and that's how, and that he is now one of them. Like these immortals, May tells us, had raised the city and built the labyrinth as a kind of parody of religion, the irrationality of its passage contrasting with the rationality mortals ascribe to the gods. So what does May mean by this? The labyrinth is a parody of religion. So basically he means that people were just projecting their desires onto immortality, onto the afterlife. They imagined that the gods, the immortal beings, would be like them if only they had all the time in the world to finish their projects. So they'll be rational, they'll be perfect, they'll be complete, they'll be finally living for their purpose. And so this is the wishful thinking we've seen last time with the promises of an afterlife. But like for Catharphilus, getting to the city of the immortal doesn't mean that we will find what we hoped we'll find there. Like immortality isn't like what we have imagined. As we said earlier, religion is supposed to give meaning to our lives by promising us that we will survive our death, but it also gives us something else, which is morality, in the sense that it tells us what is meaningful and what is not. And this is where religion turns into its parody. Like, remember that religion doesn't just give you an afterlife, but also a test, a temporality in which you have to earn that afterlife, right? So this means that it does not negate mortality, but places it within its own narrative because it knows that it is through our mortality that we have meaning. So to quote May, mortality offers meaning to the events of our lives, and morality helps us navigate that meaning. If one lives a limited amount of time, then it matters how one lives and acts. That is the urging of religion to make this life something that matters in the right way. So in this sense, religion acknowledges that you are mortal and that you only have a limited amount of time to live, and so it is important to live in the right way. So living in the right way means that you know what matters in life, and religion tells you what matters through morality. The problem is, since we've seen that death cuts all of those short, religion needs to add another flavor to the cocktail. It adds immortality. And so this is where the parody begins. As May says, religion has it both ways. There is meaning to life as a prelude to the next, but also the immortality of one's continued existence. And so we want the meaning that comes from our mortality, and at the same time, we want that meaning to survive. Sorry. We want that meaning to survive mortality. So religion wants to have it both ways. And the issue is, well, it can't. Adding the immortality flavor in our wishful thinking is going to be an eternity of bliss and meaningfulness, but what we'll find is probably something like the troglodyte's labyrinth. Okay? Instead of finding things complete and done, things finished and meaningful and well ordered, we find the opposite. We find things in ruins, pointless as expressed by the labyrinth, and a complete retreat from action. As May describes, the labyrinth was the last great project undertaken by the Immortals. For them, it marks a stage at which, judging that all undertakings are in vain, they determined to live in thought, pure speculation. They erected their structure, forgot it, and went to dwell in the caves. And so in the end, the troglodyte no longer give a shit about anything. And thus nothing that they do or experience has meaning because nothing is important. Whether they're in hell or heaven, the result will be the same. Nothing matters anymore. So it is a world without any limits, without any boundaries, without any distinction between good or bad. So religion may try to maintain that there still are boundaries, that there are still distinctions between good and evil, but remember that religion is coming from the standpoint of mortals, not of immortals. You know, if you actually are immortal, the afterlife is not at all going to be like immortality is not at all going to be like, you know, religion promises. You know, because religion is the product of mortals who are just trying to cope with the fact that they are going to die. So religion hopes that when we get to be immortal being in the afterlife, we will still behave like mortal ones. Like we still know what's meaningful and what is not. We would still do things instead of being completely passive. Religion thinks of its afterlife as an immortal realm fit for mortal creatures. But as we said, we cannot switch our perspective from the point of view of immortals. Okay, this is another point that we've talked about in the first video. So we are only talking from the point of view of mortal beings, okay? Because we are not immortal. We are mortal beings, and even if here we're talking about, you know, what life would be if we were immortal, we are talking about it from the perspective of a mortal creature. If, as I have argued, death is the central fact of human life, then it becomes difficult to imagine a life without it, indeed. In some sense, an immortal life is no longer a human life. So that's why Borges calls his immortals troglodytes. They are no longer humans. And like we've seen with the two cures, one requires that your cognitive activities regress, while the other is immortality. Well, it turns out that even immortality requires that we regress to a lower state. So it is important to recognize this limit in religion, that it cannot have it both ways. We're either mortal or immortal, and if we are immortal, we cannot live like mortal beings. And if we are mortal beings, we cannot live like immortal ones. So to go back to May, the troglodytes, once immortal, they cannot have the meaning that faith would want us to have in this life. Quote, "Without limits, this life cannot take on the meaning that religion finds in it. As a result, the universe seems less rational than it does to a religion of mortal life. The meaning found in the latter does not exist in the former. Without meaning, immortal life becomes irrational. The gods who designed the universe then seemed less inclined to have created an orderly universe where everything has its place, but instead to have created a universe without point or meaning. In this universe, one wanders aimlessly forever, crossing and recrossing paths that add up to no particular pattern. What better way to reflect this than by building a labyrinth that leads nowhere? So far we have argued that immortality, it turns out to be pretty bad for us, but we didn't argue that death is good for us either. So sure, we said that it turns out that death was giving us meaning all along, but we didn't solve the problem of death also taking away that meaning. So mostly we just proved that immortality would be meaningless for us, but we still haven't proven that death is better. So the problem of the first chapter is still unsolved. What we just argued so far is that both death and immortality are bad for us. Both can give us some meaning, but after a certain point, they both take it away. So in death, by dying, and in immortality, by boredom. But we do have knowledge of where to look between these two options. Death is the one we should be looking in for finding meaning, as it is the only thing that gives it to us. Like May argues that in our mortality and awareness, like in our morality and in our awareness of mortality, it is our mortality and awareness of mortality that gives our lives meaning. Quote, "It is precisely our mortality that gives the significance to our actions, that makes them important, that makes them matter. It is death, then, that seems to give our life shape." So, as we said all along, human beings are first and foremost mortal creatures. That's what makes us humans. We die. And the other thing that makes us human is the awareness of death. Being mortal without that kind of awareness will just make us an animal, as we said. But some animals seem to be aware of their death, but that's not the point. The point is, losing that awareness makes us something other than human. And as we've said, something other than human means something less than human. And so, equally, immortality would also be against our nature as human beings. Would become something else altogether. Now, to be clear, May is not denying that it is impossible to be speculators in the sense, and it's not like it's impossible to conceive of creatures who have thoughts that are divorced from their existence or their personal lives, and who take on activities, not just intellectual ones, solely as activities for their own sake. Such creatures can exist, and maybe they can have meaningfulness in those activities, but what May is saying that those creatures are not human beings. They won't have the same passions, interests, or structures of existence like we do. And here we are concerned with human beings. And so far, May is arguing that immortality isn't just fit for human beings. We are not compatible with it because an immortal life, as we said, is shapeless. And shapelessness can work perfectly with shapeless beings, with infinite or immortal beings, but it doesn't work for us, for mortal human beings. And so, a point to bring here is that when looked from both perspectives, when the mortal looks at the life of the immortal, as when the immortal looks at the life of the mortal, they say the same thing about the other's life. It is meaningless. It is, interesting to compare, for example, Macropulos and Homer here. Homer, being now a troglodyte, isn't really miserable. He is actually happy to be immortal, and he pities the mortals, saying, "Death, or its illusion, makes men precious and pathetic." They are moving because of their phantom condition. Every act they execute may be their last. There is not a face that is not on the verge of dissolving, like a face in a dream. Everything among the mortals has the value of the irretrievable and the perilous. And by comparison, Homer praises the lives of animals because animals are not aware of their death, and he calls that ignorance a kind of immortality. Quote, "To be immortal is commonplace, except for man. All creatures are immortal, for they are ignorant of death. What is divine, terrible, incomprehensible is to know that one is immortal." And so the terrible and incomprehensible parts can override the divine one. But here Homer is actually saying that knowing your immortality is sublime. Homer is quite content with being immortal. It suits him. And the reason it suits him is because, well, he is no longer human. And so compare this with Macropulos. Now she is miserable because she is miserable, but not because she is immortal. It's because she is still human while being immortal. She is seeing herself becoming a troglodyte, like we can put it that way. She's aware that she continues to be immortal, and so she is losing her humanity. That is why in the end she refuses to drink the potion anymore, because the potion was maintaining her immortality, and so she decides to die. Both of these two, Homer and Macropulos, comment on the existence of the other in the same way. Being a troglodyte, Homer sees the mortal life as meaningless, and being a human being, Macropulos sees immortality as meaningless. And so the only problem is that the mortal gets kind of fucked twice, because although he agrees that the immortal life is meaningless, he also agrees with the troglodyte that a mortal life, because of death, is also meaningless. So for us, for human beings at least, both mortality and immortality are bad. Both cast shadows over our lives. They do it differently, each one in its own twisted way, but they both negate the meaning of our lives. However, it can be this difference between them that determines why death is the one that suits us best when it comes to a meaningful life. So death negates meaning by incompletion, all right? Our engagements will be cut short, and because they matter to us, death will, when it cuts these threads, is a threat to our meaning. But as we've seen, death has an ambivalent and dual role in this. Quote, "On the one hand, it is death that lends our lives urgency and beauty. Without death, little seems to matter. With death, much does. On the other hand, death threatens the very meaningfulness it delivers. The fragility of our lives cuts in two directions. It both makes and unmakes the importance of those lives. It makes them in the sense that it lends an exigency to what we do, and irretrievability, a singularity and a uniqueness to the moments of our lives. It unmakes them in the sense of threatening that exigency and that singularity at every moment with annihilation." And so this duality regarding the fragility of our lives, the fact that it makes and unmakes the importance of our lives, that is missing in immortality. Like, immortality doesn't make anything, it just unmakes. What it unmakes aren't the projects or engagements themselves, but their importance of meaning. So in the case of death, you can still find ways to make your projects and life matter. With immortality, well, you can't. So true death will sap both the project and its importance, whereas immortality leaves your projects be. But immortality, unlike death, saps the importance. It doesn't allow for it to exist in the first place, you know? Like, it doesn't allow you to have importance at all. Quote, with immortality, the threads of our lives are not exposed to being cut arbitrarily. Instead, those threads seem to have no particular color and form, no particular pattern. So the dilemma is like this. Would you prefer a short life in which you can make projects that matter just for a while without any big closure, and once the life ends there won't be any meaning added to whatever your life was, or an immortality in which you can make all the projects you desire but none of them would ever matter? Or we can say you can say, it would like a novel that is, would you like a novel that is unfinished, that you can just read just once, but has, awesome moments in it, or one that never finishes, that always keeps going, and all the awesome moments can never be distinguishable from the dull, trivial, and bad ones. And so, as May says about this never-ending novel, this is one that you must keep reading. You can never put the book down. Imagine that, quote, imagine a novel that you literally could not put down, but not because it is so interesting. It might be interesting for the first few thousand pages or so, but the reason you cannot put it down is that you are forced to keep reading it. So both death and immortality are alike in the sense that they make the meaning withdrawal and at the end lead to a certain shapelessness. But the only difference is that with death you can make a shape out of your threads, but that shape is incomplete and perhaps weird and doesn't look like anything. But we can still we still can recognize that it is a shape. Whereas with immortality, you can never make any shape because the threads are always suspended. And so, what can we do here? So we have this dilemma on our hands, and yet obviously death is the better choice. It's the better choice than immortality, but this just tells us that with death we can know what is important from what is not. It doesn't tell us that we will know as we move through our short lives. All right? Like, in other words, a world in which we die is better than one in which we don't die, but this doesn't mean that we cannot have a good death either. That we cannot make life in a certain way that die at the right moment. Perhaps we can organize our lives in such a way that we can end up with a complete shape, right? So here we will talk about the quality of one's life. Like, immortality is off the table. Let's just make the best with what we got. Can we have a life that is satisfying? In other words, can we live in such a way that when death strikes, it would be a good death? By which I don't mean that it relieves you from a long life of suffering, but rather that it kills you at the right moment, at the right time. So, of course, here suicide isn't part of this discussion, and terminal illness or extremely painful treatments for an incurable diseases don't count either. We are talking about something else, okay? So we just need to explain what we mean by the right time. So here May brings a debate between two philosophers. Well, first of all, there is Nagel. He said that since life itself is good, and so death is always an evil for us, he ends his essay with, if there is no limit to the amount of life that it would be good to have, then it may be that a bad end is in store for us all. So we have Nagel, who says that death is always bad, that there is no right time to die. And on the other side, we have Bernard Williams, who took issue with Nigel's concept that death is always an evil. And so Williams, in his critique of Nagel, took him to be arguing in favor of immortality. Since death is always an evil, the implication is that we should look for immortality. Now, As May points, Nigel himself never argued for immortality. That wasn't the point of his essay on death. But one can say, like Williams, that concluding that immortality is good would logically follow from Nigel's argument. So as Williams say, death is at any time an evil, according to Nigel. Nigel indeed, from this point of view, does seem to permit that conclusion. But wider consequences follow. For if all that is true, then it looks as though it would be not only always better to live, but better to live always, that is, never to die. So, what Williams rejects is to say that death is always bad. And for him, if we hold that view, we have to be committed to a view in favor of immortality, which he himself argues against. If immortality is evil, then we need to have a way to make death not evil. And so for Williams, that way resides in the right moment of death. Quote, his conclusion then is that mortality is not an evil, it's all a question of timing. So the problem isn't death, it's more the moment you die. Like, that's the problem. The problem is in the moment. As we said, the problem with immortality is that it drags too long our projects to the point of making them boring. And so the key for Williams is just to die before we get to the boredom part. Like, dying before we start projects or before the project is brought to its completion, that's bad, that's an evil. And dying after the project dragged for too long is also evil. And so the right time of death is, therefore, it's between these two extremes. It's at the tipping point in which we will enter the bad side of immortality. Okay? So in other words, the problem with death is that, quote, necessarily it tends to be either too early or too late. Elena Macropoulos reminds us that it can be too late, and many, as against Lucretus. Lucretus is a philosopher, we will talk about him next time, need no reminding that it can be too early. If that is any sort of dilemma, it can, as things still are, and if one is exceptionally lucky, be resolved not by doing anything, but just by dying shortly before the horrors of not doing so become evident. Okay, so we would need a life in which we have not all the time in the world to do the things that we want to do, but enough time to do the things that are the most meaningful to us. Once it is done, we can just, leave the stage and be content with what we had. And so we can think of some people like that. Like, certainly there are people who on their deathbed reflected on their lives and were like, yeah, I'm happy with it, I did everything I wanted. Certainly some people have died at the right moment, having come to terms with their death, made peace with their mortality or whatever. That, however, as May argues, is still a very small minority. Like, for most of us, we don't die like that. And so it is important to remind ourselves that these people who died at the right moment, well, they knew that they were dying and probably had an idea about when they are going to die. And so, knowing that, they probably made peace with their death, not necessarily because their lives were meaningful, but because, they are feeling that their death is coming soon. So coming to terms with death feels like it's their only choice. But for most of us, we don't know when we die. We don't die like that. Remember the third theme, inevitability and uncertainty. So to be like those peoples would require an immense amount of luck, an amount that we certainly cannot engineer for most people. So certainly we can organize our societies so that people get longer lives, and so they would get opportunities to engage in the meaningful projects that they want. If you live in a country that has bad infrastructures, an economic system that exploits you, that you have oppressive cultures, then yeah, your chances of dying at the right moment are more diminished than someone who lives in a country in which they can have the time to engage in leisure activities, who has the time to work on their relationships, who has a job that they're passionate about and doesn't overwork them to death and pays enough to live with dignity and have, decent lives or whatever. So countries with strong healthcare policies and public education are certainly better at offering, a life in which you can die at the right moment than ones in which living conditions are horrible and freedom for actions or thought are too restricted. But still, as May says, despite all of the efforts we make, we can never make people die at the right moment. Like we can never make dying at the right time the norm. May seems to be more on the side of Nigel in the debate here, arguing that there is never a right time to die. Again, we cannot live in a novel that has that great ending. As he writes, for most of us, our attachment to life do not cease altogether in some orchestrated way at a particular moment that would then be the perfect moment to die. So trying to make it just that way is just unrealistic, and it comes off as completely arbitrary and completely remote. But this doesn't mean that we have to embrace immortality. As May argues, William's critique of Nigel is misleading because even though Nigel argues that death can never be good, it will always be an evil no matter the quality of our lives. Williams is wrong in saying that arguing in favor of immortality follows from that argument. Instead, May suggests that we look at another conclusion that we can draw from Nigel's argument. Quote, we can take Nigel to be arguing not that immortality is good, but that for most of us, dying at any particular moment is bad. This begins to capture the dilemma death presents to us. It is better that we are mortal creatures, but there is no good time to die. Our mortality brings our lives shape. It gives those lives coherence and meaning. It makes the moment of those lives precious, and yet dying threatens all that is all that as well. It is good that we die, but never just yet. And so for May, this is the reality we must face. The point isn't to eradicate death or to make death hit at some remote, artificial, abstract right moment, but to come to terms with death. To come to terms with the fact that death is good, despite having no right moment and despite sapping away the importance of our projects. So what we need to do is to live with death, and that will be the topic of the third and last chapter of the book. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you are enjoying these videos, and if you are reading the books, hopefully these videos will make it easier for you to read them. Thank you for your support, and I will see you next week for the